Thank you very much. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ram, thank you very, very much for that very warm introduction. Whenever I hear the phrase, our speaker today needs no introduction, which you said, I have this terrible shiver that goes down my spine, and it went down my spine as you said it today, because the first ever ministerial visit I did was when I was made Minister for Schools in 2002. And I was made Minister for Schools on a Wednesday in June in 2002. And then on the Friday, I had already planned a visit to a primary school in my constituency. So this was a school of maybe 180 kids, 5 to 11-year-olds, and the civil servants at the Department of Education said, Minister, you're a new minister, you've got to go and show that you're talking to teachers, talking to pupils, talking to parents. This visit to your primary school in your constituency, St. Mary's Primary School, provides the perfect opportunity to invite the national media to come and see you in a local context. So I said, fine, this is excellent news. We arrive at the school, 9 o'clock on Friday morning. The media is there. The headmistress welcomes me. She says, Mr. Miliband, we're so honored that you're here. Come and meet the children. There are 150 children, not sitting on chairs as comfortable as yours, but sitting on the floor in the school hall. And she says, she walks in, we walk in, the media walk in, the cameras walk in, and the headmistress says the phrase, children, our guest today needs no introduction. Exactly as Mr. Ram did. And of course, I immediately have a terrible feeling, because she then says, children, can anyone tell me who our guest is? And you've already guessed, there was this terrible silence in the hall. The media cameras keep on whirring. And she says, but children, we did practice this yesterday. I was already, instead of being 6'2 1/4", I was already down to 5'6". The poor headmistress, her big day was being spoiled, and she said, she was very embarrassed. She said, children, someone must be able to tell us who our honored guest is. I mean, our guest today is going to make a big difference to our school. We've waited a long time for someone as important as this to come to our school to help us achieve our dreams for our school. Someone must be able to tell me who our guest is. And finally, this little boy put up his hand, and the mistress said, yes, tell us who our guest is. And the boy said, Miss, is it the man who's come to fix the electricity? And so this phrase that I need no introduction brings back this memory, which maybe it's healthy for every minister to be brought down to size when they take up office. I feel very honored and privileged to be here today, to have been welcomed so warmly by the Reddy family. They've embraced me in a really very, very warm way over the last 24 hours and shown me some tremendous Chennai hospitality. I was told that Chennai is the workhorse of India. But if so, it's an extremely educated, cultured, broad-minded workhorse. I've had a chance to get a sense of that in the last 24 hours. And I feel very excited at the prospect of being able to discuss with such a broad range of the Chennai community, from business, from politics, from diplomacy, from the public and private sectors together, some of the big issues that confront you and confront us. The Reddys have given me a very, very broad topic, a very broad mandate, and they've asked me to try and offer some reflections on what is a really tumultuous time in world affairs. Many of the write-ups of 2011 that were done in the newspapers, even in the Indian reviews of the year that I had a chance to see over the last 3 days since I arrived in Delhi on Thursday, have remarked that there seemed to be more news in 2011 and more unexpected news. And I want to try and reflect on that. And I think the way to start is with a metaphor. And it's a metaphor that isn't mine, but it's a metaphor that was given to me by Madeleine Albright, who was the US Secretary of State in the second Clinton administration from 1996 to, well, she took office in January 97 until the end of the Clinton term in 2000. And the metaphor is as follows. She said to me that in the Cold War period, after the Second World War and up until 1990, in the Cold War period, international relations were like driving a tanker up the Suez Canal. Extremely narrow. You grip the steering wheel, you focus straight ahead, and you drive very slowly and very straight. She then said that in the post-Cold War period, in the 1990s when she was in office, international relations and foreign policy were not like the Suez Canal. Things opened up. It was like steering a ship in the English Channel, she said. So there was water all around you, but you could see land 26 miles across from Dover to Calais. But in the 2000s, in 2011, 2012, in this period, in the post-Cold War period, that isn't the right way of conceiving of international relations. International relations today is like being on the high seas, and you can't see land, and you haven't got a very good compass. And the navigators of the international scene have got to find their way forward in this new environment. And what I want to try and do in the next 25 minutes or so, half an hour, is describe what is this new environment. What are the gusts of wind that are affecting the ships in these open seas? How should we understand the pressures that are existing on states in the modern world? And then secondly, I want to try and discuss how should we respond. So quite a broad canvas. So let me start with what are the gusts of wind that are affecting these ships of state in the modern world. And I just want to highlight for you 5 that seem to me, on reflection, one of the sad things about being out of office is that you have time on your hands, but one of the blessings is that you can reflect on what is buffeting the international system. And I think these are the 5 big forces that I see. The first is a very obvious one, being in Chennai, but I think it does have to come first because it underpins everything else, whether the Euro crisis or American understanding of its role in the world, and that is the seismic shift in economic power that's taking place from, broadly speaking, from west to east at the moment. 50 to 70 million people in Asia are going to join the global middle class each year over the next 20 years. They're going to go into that income bracket that the UN defines as $6,000 to $18,000 a year. 50 to 70 million a year. And that is the kind of shift and the speed of shift that has never happened before. The Economist, on the back page of The Economist, the first issue of 2012, it's updated its calculator for the way in which economic power is shifting. They now predict that China will become the world's biggest economy in 2018. They say that by 2030, India could be the world's 3rd biggest economy. Just in parentheses, incidentally, it's worth noting, in previous periods of economic history, when countries have become the world's largest economy, they've had relatively high per capita income. We're about to go into a period where the world's largest economy, whether it happens in 2018 or 2025 or 2028, the world's largest economy, China, will have a pretty low per capita income. And there are all sorts of challenges associated with that that I might come back to. It's the first time that's ever happened. And I think it's interesting that if you read Jim O'Neill's book, Jim O'Neill is the man who coined the idea of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, as the new forces in the global economy. If you look at his new book, he's got a list of the next 11. And 6 of the next 11 countries are in Asia as well. He lists them as Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea, and, interestingly, Pakistan. But 6 of the 11 countries that are going to be big economic actors in the next period, he says, are in Asia. And I think this is a fundamental change. It doesn't mean the end of America's place as a superpower. It doesn't mean the end of Europe's position as the world's largest, richest single market. But it does mean that there is a shift in economic power of a scale that hasn't happened before, with I think, big implications. And I'll come back to them. Second big gust of wind is one that we probably wouldn't have talked about if I'd been here 13 months ago. And it's the gust of wind that is shifting power from organizations, public and private, to people. And you saw it in great evidence in Tahrir Square in January of 2011. The shift of power enabled by new technology to allow millions of people around the world not just to connect with each other, but to aggregate their views and to organize, is, I think, a major shift for politics and for economics. I call it the civilian surge. And it's a surge of power that's gone to individuals who can now connect with each other and create a global conversation in a way that's never happened before. This isn't just about autocratic countries struggling to contain the aspirations of their own people, although I think it has big implications for that as well. It's also affecting democratic societies. You've seen that in the social movement in your own country over the last year around the issue of corruption, which has mobilized civil society in quite a strong way. And I think that any of you in business will have read the stories of how Gap tried to change its logo, but were pushed back by a rebellion from its own customers. The Bank of America tried to introduce a $5 fee for every time anyone used their debit card. Customers left Bank of America very quickly, and they had to reverse the decision. Netflix tried to impose a charge, and it was pushed back by 800,000 of its customers, who within a week had shifted their custom. This civilian surge, this surge of power to individuals, is, I think, very, very significant. In the undemocratic world, in the autocratic world, it's raised the barrier for the hurdle, if you like, for accountable government. It doesn't mean that democracy is going to suddenly, multi-party democracy is going to spring up in parts of the Middle East or in China overnight. It does mean that rulers in those countries are going to have to legitimate their decisions and know they're held accountable in a way that they hadn't been until recently. The flow of ideas is just too open. Third, and I think that it's got parallels in business. Third big change is one which, in a way, it must feel, I fear, will sound almost maybe ignorant or it may be insensitive to talk about in a country which still has 1/3 of the world's poor people in it, which India does. But for the first time in 200 years, on a global scale, we're shifting from a period of resource plenty to resource scarcity. And this isn't just about climate change, although that is part of it. If you look at non-oil commodity prices, non-oil commodity prices have risen by more in the last 10 years than they did in the course of the Second World War. In other words, the world is on the equivalent of war footing when it comes to the mismatch of supply and demand for non-oil commodity prices. The Yemen is going to become the first country in the world literally to run out of water. You know yourselves that food prices have come off their spike, but global food prices hit a peak in December 2010. I don't think this is an accident or a blip. I think it's a fundamental shift. It's obviously related to issues of population, but it's also about urbanization, massive change going on. It's also about climate change. Fourth big gust of wind is one that is also delicate or sensitive to talk about in India and needs to be talked about with great care, and that is the rise around the world, especially in Muslim majority countries, not this country therefore, and that is the rise of political Islam. The rise in countries that are democracies, I'm thinking of countries like Turkey or countries like Indonesia, now countries like Egypt, where politicians who take their inspiration from the Quran are assuming leading positions in government. And I would say that if you think of any of the big issues around the world that need to be addressed today, whether security issues or economic issues, they need a coalition with Muslim-majority countries. And that means understanding and developing a relationship with people who call themselves Islamists and who run for election under a banner of political Islam. There are many routes to this. I think the most significant in the short term is actually a positive one. The reaction in the last 10 years against jihadism and in favour of political Islam is, I think, a wholly positive development. The only people more surprised by the changes in the Arab world over the last year than the West are Al-Qaeda and the Iranians. They were even more surprised than we were. But I think that has been a significant shift, A. B, there are many brands to this political Islamic movement. Some claim resemblance to European versions of Christian democracy. Certainly some of the Turkish leaders talk about their own movement in parallel to that, respecting private religious choices, but trying to take inspiration from religious texts into the public realm. There are many brands to it, and they're also evolving brands. There's a very interesting discussion of how the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is changing. Even as we speak, it's going to be a fixture of the scene. And I think, thirdly, these movements, as they go into the political space, are focusing on issues of identity rather than issues of piety. And certainly, if you look at the 160 or so elections around the world in the last 15 years, in which groups that have claimed political Islam as their motivating factor, the evidence is that they're moving actually towards the median voter in the centre rather than towards the extreme in the course of that period. But this is a deep and complex movement that we have to, I think, globally engage with. Now, in India, that is a particularly important question because of who your neighbour is. Your neighbour, Pakistan, was founded in the name of Islam. But over the last 60-odd years, for half that period, has been unable to maintain its democratic structures. And so the issues raised for the rest of us by the growth of political Islam are particularly poignant and difficult and challenging for you, given how difficult Pakistan has found it to sustain its democratic institutions. And I think it's worth teasing out why Pakistan has developed in the way that it has, and how its civilian institutions can be strengthened, because it seems to me that is the central challenge for the for Pakistan as a country, and is massively in the interests of India that it succeeds in doing so. Fifth flurry or fifth gust of wind I just want to, I don't have time to do justice to, is that there's one thing wrong, in my view, with Madeleine Albright's metaphor, which is that her metaphor of the open seas suggests that the boats on this sea are independent, whereas in fact they are interdependent. The actions of one boat affect the other boats, and so I'm going to abandon the metaphor now by saying that the fifth great force in the modern world is that of economic, social, health, political interdependence. There is a quote-unquote global village in which if your neighbour's house is on fire, to quote the old proverb, your house is on fire. So economic contagion, health contagion, social contagion, insecurity can spread from one part of the globe to another very, very quickly. And I think these 5 factors make this period of globalization different from any other in human history. Globalization has happened before. There have been previous waves of globalization. But there hasn't been a wave with these features that I've described today. Features in which people are connected, as well as companies and countries being connected. In which there is if you like, an asymmetric power. In which small actors can play a very big role. And I just want to dwell on that asymmetry for a moment, because I think it's important in explaining where we are. Greece is a tiny part of the European economy. 2% of the European economy, maybe. It had a 50 billion euro debt problem. That is not a very big problem in the context of the world economy. But Greece and its problems, because they haven't been addressed, threatens to upend not just the European economy, but potentially the global economy. That is an asymmetry of power of the sort that we've never seen before. In the Middle East, one of the biggest players today is Qatar, the country of Qatar. It's a tiny country, but it's got big leverage because it's founded a TV station that the majority of people in the Middle East watch, Al Jazeera. To give you a business example that I think is quite interesting, it's not mine, it comes from a scholar called Daniel Pink. He starts his latest book by saying, imagine if you'd polled 100 business economists, the best business economists in the world, 15 years ago, and said to them, who's going to win the following business race? On the one hand, Microsoft, who want to go into the encyclopedia market and replace the Encyclopedia Britannica with the best, most modern 21st century encyclopedia. They're going to pay 4,000 scholars large sums of money to produce the best material, and they're going to put it up on the web, and they're going to put every other encyclopedia company out of business. Will they win the global race, or will it be won by a company of less than 200 people, which is going to invite anyone in the world to type in their views on different issues onto the internet? A company called Wikipedia. Wikipedia didn't actually exist 15 years ago. And he says, if you'd asked the business economists who will win the global race in the encyclopedia market, this nascent bunch of technophiles or Microsoft, all 100 would have said Microsoft will definitely win. But actually they were wrong. Microsoft's encyclopedia business has gone bankrupt. And Wikipedia was quoted by Mr. Ram even in the introduction to this talk, and everyone knows who Wikipedia is. It's an asymmetric world, I think. And that brings out that there are two faces of the globalization that we're undergoing. One face is a democratizing face. It's democratizing power, it's holding power to account, it's exposing the abuse of power. But another face is not about the dynamism of democratization, it's about the instability that arises when no one seems to be in charge. When there is neither a global empire or hegemonic power that is running things, or a superpower that's able, at the click of its fingers, to bring the rest of the world to heel. There isn't a balance of power anymore, because the rising powers are not yet risen to superpower status. And there isn't shared power. There isn't shared sovereignty. There's some in the European Union, but as you've noticed, it's been under quite a lot of strain. And so these two faces of globalization, one essentially positive, about the democratization of information, of power, the other scary, really, about the threat of chaos, are competing with each other. And it seems to me that Britain and India, two countries that have benefited greatly from this recent wave of globalization in the last 20 years, have a huge amount at stake in trying to address the weaknesses and tackle them in a way that helps globalization develop, spreading prosperity, but also addressing the instabilities, the insecurities, the inequalities that are arising from it. And if we in Britain and India are interested and committed to that project, I think there are 4 areas that I would focus our attention, or ask you to think about in turning your minds to addressing the conundrums of the modern world. As you can see, I quite like lists. Sort of 5 gusts of wind, and 4 makes it, for those of you taking notes, it makes it easier to, even those of you who are not taking notes, it makes it easier to remember. At least you'll remember how many there were, how many points there were, even if you don't remember what the contents of the points were. But I just want to highlight 4 areas that I think are really important, 4 priorities for us, if we are to remedy the dangers, or address the dangers, and harness the strengths of this period of globalization. One is that there is a chronic absence of shared doctrine around the world about how to manage an interdependent world. There was a very, very clear doctrine until really 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it was a doctrine that said national sovereignty is the foundation of international law and is the guide to the relations between states around the world. It was founded in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, which asserted that what went on within a sovereign state was the business only of the citizens and the rulers of that state, and was not the business of anyone outside that state. And in a way, you can see the strengths of that system. Democratic legitimacy lies in the nation-state. National identity is still very strong. It's a political building block. But its limitations are clear in the modern world in two dimensions. One, who is to stand up for the citizens of a country when they are being abused by their own government? Is that simply written off as being a matter only for the members of the citizens of that state, and something to which the rest of us have no interest? It's the first dimension in which the assertion of national sovereignty on its own is insufficient for a global village that aspires to universal values. And the second dimension in which it's insufficient is that the actions of a nation-state can affect the lives of people on the other side of the world, whether in respect of climate change or trade or migration, and so are not just a matter for the citizens of that state, they're actually a matter for the global community. And this division between parts of the world that want to assert that there are universal values that must be upheld by the international community, and other parts that assert no, what goes on within a country is only the matter for that country, that is a schism in the modern world. If you look at almost every vote on the UN Security Council, it splits on these kind of issues. The votes on Syria, most recently, split on the question of whether or not the world as a whole had any legitimate right to comment on the actions of the Syrian government in the repression of its own people. And it's not a split between the democratic world and the undemocratic world. It's not even a split between West and East, because we often find ourselves disagreeing with our American cousins on this matter. America, like China actually, and in some ways like this country, is very leery of international treaties that fetter the sovereignty of its own government. And given its history, you can understand why. Actually, American engagement abroad, what's sometimes attacked by others as American imperialism, is actually an unusual aspect of American foreign policy, not a defining part of it. America is quite reticent about laws and treaties that will interfere in its own affairs or in others. And this schism, this philosophical issue, this absence of a shared doctrine, is a very fundamental question. So I would say to you, many of you were nodding when I said we're living in an interdependent world, where my actions can affect you and your actions can affect me. If you nod to the idea that this is an interdependent world, then it's incumbent on us to figure out how to govern it. What is the doctrine under which we govern an interdependent world? I would argue it's not enough just to say every nation is sovereign. I talk about something I call responsible sovereignty, which tries to argue that sovereignty needs a prefix. It doesn't just need an assertion, it needs a prefix. And when states abuse the rights of their own citizens, or when the states abuse the global commons, then it's right to say, no, that's not allowable. And the truth is, there's quite a lot of hypocrisy about this in international relations, and it needs to be addressed, in my view. Second key area, I would argue, is maybe ironic given the problems in the European Union at the moment. But I would argue that if we are to tackle the problems in the modern world, we are going to need more regional institutions and stronger regional institutions. I don't believe that the travails, the difficulties of the European Union and the Eurozone at the moment, that regional cooperation is wrong or bound to fail. I think it'll be a tragic lesson to learn. And I would say that for three reasons. First of all, I would argue the European Union has been a success and not a failure for the last 50 years. A success in political as well as economic and security terms. I would argue, secondly, that every country needs to secure its own region. And I argue very, very strongly that if there is to be a political settlement in Afghanistan, it doesn't just need to be an internal political settlement, where all the peoples of Afghanistan are included in the political system. It also needs to be a regional political settlement, in which all the countries of the region, including India, have a very important role to play in a compact that respects Afghan independence, but doesn't allow its problems to be exported to the rest of the region. So, and when President Obama recently, he talked about America's focus on the Pacific, he talked about America as a Pacific nation. He was defining an interest by virtue of its own region. China thinks about its interests in its own region differently than it thinks about its interests elsewhere in the world. Every country in the world needs to secure its own region. And thirdly, I think that the evidence of other parts of the world, whether in Southeast Asia or in Africa, is that the absence of regional institutions can hold back development. I feel this in Africa especially. Intra-African trade is one of the lack of intra-African trade is one of the greatest factors holding back African development at the moment. Africa desperately needs sub-regional and regional institutions to help promote trade, never mind political and other development. Third great issue that we're going to have to attend to relates to the inequalities that are growing within countries. Global inequality, the inequality between countries, is actually reducing in this phase of globalization. But as you will know from your own country, the rewards of the current phase of globalization are being very unequally distributed. And that is not a sustainable model for economic or social development, in my view. It's not a sustainable model in the so-called developed world, in the industrialized world, where the middle class is being hollowed out in a frightening way, really. Median income is falling at worst or stagnant at best in the Western world. But it's not a sustainable model in developing countries either. And the development of welfare and social policy to attenuate and, if possible, reverse the growth of inequality seems to me to be a central issue in developing a viable means of maintaining the benefits of globalization. We can return to that when we have questions. But I would say that the liberties that we enjoy are not sustainable with the inequalities that are currently growing. And the fourth and final issue that I think relates to all of the previous three concerns the management of the global commons. The air, the water, the environment, as well as the infrastructure that we depend on. I know very, very little about the high seas, despite the metaphor that I've used from Madeleine Albright. But beyond the 200-mile limit that exists around every country, it's cowboy land out there. The pillage of the high seas means that our grandchildren are going to be very lucky, many of them, to know what it means to eat a fish. And I've got interested in this through some work that's being done by the Pew Foundation in the United States, a remarkable charitable foundation. They want to do more work on this. But there are no enforced rules, despite the UN Law of the Seas, for how some 50% of the Earth's surface is used or abused. And these global commons are important for all of us. The air and the climate change challenge is one that I'm told has much greater resonance in India than it might have had 10 or even 5 years ago. But the consequences for our children and our grandchildren are going to be monumental if we don't learn to conserve and preserve the global commons. Now, when one comes from a Western country, it's very important to I think, say that will only be done if it's done in an equitable way. I don't see a contrast between equity on the one hand and dealing with these issues of the global commons on the other. Why? Because the poor pay the highest price for business as usual. It will not be the middle class in the West, or even, dare I say, in India, who pay the price of climate change. It will be the poor. It will be especially the poor in Bangladesh, actually, who will be forced to migrate, and on the back of rising sea levels. So I don't see the argument that says these global issues can't be addressed because of equity. They need to be addressed because of equity. And they require a different kind of effort from politicians as well as from business people. I've tried your patience for 35 minutes, and I promise not to go on for more than 40, so let me finish with just the following thought, which is that if you think about the last century, it's been a long debate about the relationship between economics and security. Some people used to argue that the growth of economic integration would mean the end of war. And 100 years ago, a famous book was published by a man called Norman Angell, who became a Labour MP, actually. He wrote a book in 1910 which essentially argued that far from military security or military expansion being the route to economic security, he argued that economic integration was the route to military peace, military security. And tragically, 4 years later, he was proved wrong in the most bloody and awful way in the First World War. But what's interesting, if you contrast those who argue that economic integration will render war impossible, and those who argue that military security is the basis for proper economic integration, both of them miss out politics. They miss out national politics and they miss out international politics. And I think the lesson of the last year is that if you miss out politics, then you're going to miss the big changes that are going on in the world. In this, Britain and India both have vibrant politics, to put it mildly. The political debate in both of our countries is pretty hot and engaged, and the dilemmas of democratic systems are as evident often as their strengths. But I think there is one thing that's relevant. If you accept that into the debate about the relationship of economics to security, politics has to be inserted, there's one thing that's relevant, which is that Britain can still produce ideas, politicians can still make speeches, they can still try and set the agenda, but the decisive player among the two of us is actually India. And that is a blessing for you and a burden for you as you think about the next phase of your economic and social and political development. The burdens of leadership are currently unequally shared, and when I was in government, and to be fair, the current government, we both support Indian entry onto the Security Council so that you can bear a greater share of the burdens of leadership. There are blessings in such responsibilities, but there are also travails and burdens in those responsibilities. What I would say is that both of us have a role to play, and if we don't, the world will be much, much poorer and much less safe for it. Thank you very much indeed.